Alright, so in this video we're being asked to solve a couple equations using the quadratic formula. And we'll just give you a brief uh, overview of what the quadratic formula, the quadratic equation is. Basically the quadratic equation is if you have a quadratic equation in the term of ax squared, the general format here, plus bx plus c equals 0. It has to be in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Then you can use the quadratic equation, the quadratic formula, to find out what your values of x are that make this equation true. So, and the quadratic equation is, and I'll use lowercase because that's what usually is used, you have the opposite of b, all right, negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and all of that divided by 2 times a. So there's your quadratic equation. So then that's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that's the equation that we'll use to solve these next two problems because they told us specifically to use the quadratic formula. All right? So our first equation, there we go. Our first problem that we're being asked is negative 10x plus 4 minus 3x squared equals 0. Now just for simplicity and to be consistent, we'll rearrange this as negative 3x squared minus 10x plus 4 equals 0. So we can come back and use our quadratic equation, and we'll go ahead and write that out again just as a reminder. We'll write it up here so we don't run out of room. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X equals. All right, so first thing we want to do is identify what our terms are. This negative 3 is a, this negative 10 is b, and this positive 4 is c. So to find our solution, we'll say x equals a negative b, and that's going to be a positive 10, plus or minus the square root of 10 squared minus 4 times a negative 3, because a is a negative 3 in this case, times a positive 4, which is c, and all of that divided by 2a, which is negative 3. So our solution is, for values of x that make this true, are 10 plus or minus the square root of 10 squared minus 4, minus a negative 4 times a negative 3 times a 4. So we can work all that out. That's equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of 100. A minus 4 times a minus 3 is a positive 12. And then a positive 12 times 4 is 48. And then 2 times a negative 3 will give us a negative 6. So we'll come down a little bit more here. X equals 10 plus or minus the square root of 148 divided by a negative 6. And that is equal to 10 divided by, we can split this up now because they're both divided by a negative 6. So we can say a negative 10 over 6 plus or minus the square root of 148 divided by a negative 6. So the square root of 148, we can hopefully break that down. We'll find out here. Equals negative 10. We can reduce 10 over 6. We'll go ahead and do that. We can write that, since they're both divisible by 2, we can say a negative 5/3 plus or minus. Now, the square root of 148, you've got 2, and you can divide that by 4, it looks like. So it'll be 4 times, 4 goes into 14 3 times, so it'll be 4 times 37 over negative 6. So that's a negative 5/3 plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2. And the square root of 37 is the square root of 37. 37 is a prime number, so that's as far as we can go with that. And then we can reduce this negative 2/6 to a negative 1/3. So our solutions to this equation are x equals negative 5/3 plus a negative 1/3, which would be, in this case, a minus. So minus 5/3 minus 1/3 times the square root of 37, and a minus 5/3 plus a 1/3 times the square root of 37. Now, in all practicality, if you were trying to actually solve this, you wouldn't leave it in this form. You'd actually you'd find out what the decimal value is at the square root of 37, and multiply that by 1/3, and then add all that together. So you'd end up with two numbers that make this true. But for our purposes here, we're just going to leave it as this. That's as far as we can go without using our calculator to simplify that. So in our next question, we're being asked, bear with me just a second. Our equation is 8x squared plus 1 equals 5x. Now remember, for quadratic, to use the quadratic equation, it has to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So we'll get this equation in this form by subtracting 5x from both sides of the equation. Plus 1 equals 0. And again, we'll come over and we'll write our quadratic equation. You do it often enough, you'll have it memorized. Negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So, in this problem, a is positive 8, b is negative 5, and c is 1. So we'll come over here and say x equals negative b, opposite of b, so in this case that's a positive 5, plus or minus the square root of a negative 5 squared minus 4 times 8 times 1, all divided by 2 times 8. So x equals 5 plus or minus. Negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25. Negative 4 times 8 is a negative 32. And 2 times 8 is 16. Now, 25 minus 32 will give us a negative 7. So that's going to be, we'll write that out, 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 7 over 16. So the square root of negative 7 is the same thing as saying 5 times plus or minus square root of negative 1 times the square root of 7. We're just splitting it up. Negative 1 times, and then the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 7. And that is still divided by 16. So we can rewrite this as 5 plus or minus square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 7. 7 is a prime number, so the square root of 7 is the square root of 7. And 16. So those are our solutions for x. X equals 5 plus or minus I times the square root of 7 divided by 16. So we'll have two solutions for that. We have 5 plus I square root of 7, 5 minus I times the square root of 7, all divided by 16. So that's how we use the quadratic formula to solve to find what the solutions are that make that equation true.